In this video, we're just going to run through an example of how to calculate real GDP and nominal GDP. And it's going to be very straightforward. We're just going to have one good over a few years with changing prices and changing outputs. This is going to be, important because it gives us an example of how to do this, and it translates to multiple, goods and multiple prices. What's important to remember is that in a $20 trillion economy, this is actually quite difficult, but theoretically it is pretty straightforward. So here's our example. We've got cars in 2008, 2009, and 2010. And the quantity is changing, so we have 10, 12, and 13. And the price is changing, so we have 20,000, 24,000, and 26,000. So nominal GDP in this example is very straightforward. We just multiply quantity times price and get nominal GDP. So in 2008, that's 10 times 20,000 or 200,000. In 2009, it's 12 times 24,000 or 288,000. And in 2010, it's 13 times 26,000 or 338,000. Now, if we had more than one good, we would just do this for all of the goods and add them up. And it's important to think about why we need prices, right? We need prices because prices tell us the relative value of different goods. So if we want to add up, cars and oranges and candy bars and shirts, all of those things, the only way to compare them is in dollars. And so we need those prices. But the problem is here that we don't know if nominal GDP, we don't know how much nominal GDP is increasing in our example because of a change in the amount we produce and a change in the price. Now, we could figure it out pretty easily when we just have one good, but when we have lots and lots of goods, that's going to be pretty hard. And so what we do with real GDP is that we choose a base year. And in this case, we're going to choose 2009 as our base year. And then we just use that price. And so real GDP then in 2008, we use 2008 quantity, that's 10, and the 2009 price, that's 24,000. So 10 times 24,000 is 240,000. That's real GDP in 2008. 2009 isn't going to change because we're already using 2009 prices. So 12 times 24,000, still 288,000. And then in 2010, we have 13 cars. We still use the 2009 price, 24,000, and we get 312,000. So now we can compare 240,000 to 312,000 as our actual growth in real GDP based on common prices. And obviously, if we had lots and lots of different goods, this would make it a lot easier to compare real values. We can't just compare quantities, right? Some quantities might be going up, others might be going down. Now, you'll often see the term chained dollars. And chained dollars are a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about them in the appendix to Chapter 2 a little bit, although we're not going to get into too much detail. But the relative prices are really the weights, right, that we're using to construct this real GDP. And we have to have a base year, right? And so in this case, our base year was 2009. The Bureau of Economic Analysis seems to still be using 2012 as their most common base year. And basically that just allows us to compare GDP across years. So here is a graph that we already looked at in Chapter 1 of real and nominal GDP. The real GDP is in blue, the nominal GDP is in red. And of course, we generally have inflation in this country, and so our real GDP is going to be larger than our nominal GDP in years prior to the base year, which is 2012, as you can see from the vertical axis. And after 2012, nominal GDP will be above real GDP. So you can see that nominal GDP increases by a lot more. Between 1960 and 2014, nominal GDP increased by a factor of 32. But we're not actually 32 times richer than in 2014 as we were in 1960, right? Real GDP increased by about a factor of 5, which is still quite substantial, right? It means people on average, and that's important because wages for a lot of different people sort of stagnated, especially from about 1970 onward. But average GDP per capita, or average GDP anyway, increased by a factor of about 5. GDP per capita won't have increased by quite that much because population has grown at that time as well. So we do have to be a little bit careful when we're talking about GDP. When we're reading about GDP, nominal GDP is often called, dollar GDP or GDP in current dollars. Real GDP might be called GDP in terms of goods, which isn't exactly accurate. GDP in constant dollars, that's more accurate. GDP adjusted for inflation, or GDP in chain dollars, or GDP in a certain year's dollars, like 2009 dollars or 2012 dollars. In this book, GDP will refer to real GDP, right? That's mostly what we're interested in. And so Y with a subscript of T will denote real GDP in year T. And if we are specifically talking about nominal GDP, we'll put a dollar sign in front of it. So it'll be $Y sub T will be the current dollar GDP in that year. Now, here's a look at real GDP growth annually since, I think we go back to about 1960 here. You can see 1960s, 1970s, apart from some recessions, had fairly good GDP growth, as did the sort of second half of the 1980s. The 1990s had real good GDP growth and okay GDP growth before the financial crisis. Then the financial crisis was significant. And then we recovered pretty well, not quite as well as, say, the 1990s. And then, of course, we've had COVID. When you see these graphs, right, so these graphs are pretty common in macroeconomics. What you'll see is these shaded bars. These shaded bars are recessions. And you can tell they're recessions because GDP tends to shrink there. There's no official definition of a recession in the United States. The National Bureau of Economic Research has a recession dating committee, which is the only kind of dating that economists get. No, but they basically look backwards in time and say, okay, we think the recession started at this date and ended at this date. So, for example, they will date the recession related to the COVID-19 pandemic probably starting in March 2020, and we'll see when they end it. It's going to be interesting because we recovered there in the third quarter. Now the fourth quarter is looking softer. We'll have to see how the first quarter of 2021 goes. Now, one of the most complicated things to do in looking at nominal GDP and real GDP, apart from doing the chained prices, which we'll talk about in the appendix, is this idea of hedonic pricing. And the problem is that, goods don't stay the same from 2000 to 2020, right? If you're thinking about a laptop, for example, laptops tend to both get better in quality and get cheaper in price. And so the example here is that the quality of new laptops, as measured by the Department of Commerce, has increased by 18%. Now, what does that mean? Well, that 18% has to be taken with, somewhat of a grain of salt. It means it's faster. It means it's got better, storage. It's got more RAM. It's got a better screen. But all of those things will be valued by people differently, and they have to try to think of how does the average consumer value these quality improvements. And at the same time, the typical laptop has also gotten cheaper by about 7% a year since 1995. And so what they do is they do a quality adjusted price. That's what it means to do hedonic pricing. That, the average price of a laptop has fallen by 25% per year, or 18 plus 7. And that's a very complicated thing to do, but that's also very important to do, as quality improvements give you a better product. Even if it's, not cheaper, it might be the same price, right? If you think about cars have gotten a bit more expensive over the last 40 years, maybe in real terms, but their quality improvements are probably larger than that. And so, the dollar per quality of car is probably improved.